A very warm welcome to my channel, War Chronicle. And today, we're going to discuss a question that has been asked by many. Can air superiority actually win wars? Now, this is a little bit different from can air power win wars, which is a debate that has gone back and forth for decades. But today, we'll specifically be looking at air superiority, or lack thereof, and how it can turn the tide of a conflict without even firing a shot. Now, there are numerous examples throughout history where air superiority was decisive, but for the purpose of brevity, I'm just going to focus on three: the Battle of Britain, the Kosovo War, and more recently, the war in Afghanistan. If you'd like me to expand on these examples or make a separate video discussing other conflicts, then let me know in the comments below. But for now, let's get into it. So to establish some basic terminology here, when we talk about air superiority, we don't mean absolute control of the skies. This is practically impossible to achieve, and even the most dominant air forces in the world do unclaim it. What we mean instead is the ability to operate freely within a certain area of the sky and to deny that same freedom to the enemy. This is usually measured in terms of airspace, either in the general sense or down to specific altitudes. For example, local superiority would refer to having control of the airspace within a certain radius. It's like within a province or a region. Meanwhile, for more comprehensive control, we talk about controlling the airspace up to a certain altitude. For example, if you could fly a fighter jet up to 40,000 feet without fear of being intercepted, then you would have what we call air superiority up to that altitude. The first case we're going to look at is the Battle of Britain in 1940. As you all probably know, the German attack on Britain began not with an invasion across the Channel, but with an air campaign. The Luftwaffe aimed to destroy the Royal Air Force, so that Britain would be unable to mount any effective defense against a subsequent invasion. However, things didn't go according to plan. Despite fierce fighting and heavy losses on both sides, the British were able to hold out, and eventually, the Germans gave up on achieving air superiority and shifted their focus to bombing London. We've already done a couple videos covering this topic in greater detail, so I won't rehash everything here. But what's important to understand is that even though the Germans failed to achieve total air superiority, they still had success in their initial air campaign. In fact, they inflicted such heavy casualties on the RAF that at one point, Fighter Command only had enough pilots to field one single combat-ready squadron. So how did the British win despite losing so many planes and pilots? Well, in essence, they simply avoided decisive engagements. When the numbers were too heavily stacked against them, British pilots would employ hit-and-run tactics, harassing the Germans, but never risking a dogfight. Even when the RAF was at its lowest point, Fighter Command still managed to score victories over the Luftwaffe, preventing Germany from declaring full victory and establishing superiority. But it was until the British were able to train and equip new pilots that they were able to take back the initiative and begin shooting down more planes than they lost. This shift marked a turning point in the battle, and from that moment on, the Luftwaffe never again achieved the same level of success as before. Although the Battle of Britain is perhaps the most famous example, its principle of achieving victory without outright winning the battle can also be applied to more modern conflicts. In the Kosovo War of the late 90s, NATO faced a similar challenge. Despite having overall superiority, they were unable to achieve total dominance over the skies due to the limited performance of some of NATO's aircraft. More specifically, this problem affected the close air support missions. Since NATO didn't have enough aircraft that could perform low-altitude flights in a counterinsurgency role, they instead relied on the much larger and heavier strike aircraft, like the F-15E Strike Eagle, to do the job. Now, this was unideal since the F-15E. It is undesigned to loiter around at low altitudes, and it doesn't carry the right kind of munitions for counterinsurgency operations. But since NATO couldn't achieve total superiority and didn't have the right platforms for the job, they had to improvise. So instead of trying to push the enemy into the open, where they could be easily destroyed by NATO's superior firepower, the coalition opted for a different strategy. They targeted key infrastructure like roads, bridges, and supply depots, effectively denying them to the enemy. This prevented the Serbian army from massing large amounts of troops in a single location, where they could then be bombed by NATO's superior firepower. Instead, the Serbs were forced to disperse their units, which resulted in lower troop morale, hampered logistical support, and generally poor battlefield effectiveness. All of this ultimately contributed to the Serbian army's defeat, despite NATO never achieving complete superiority. Now we move on to the most recent example, the war in Afghanistan. This is probably the least clear-cut example of the three, since the US did achieve air superiority early on and then lost it. But nonetheless, it's still a good example of how air superiority can help win wars without even firing a shot. Early on in the war, the US and NATO allies enjoyed complete superiority. There was no Afghan air force to speak of, and the Soviet Union. Its collapse in 1991 meant that there were no external powers providing air support either. But over time, this changed. The Taliban gradually acquired more and more anti-aircraft missiles, and in some areas, they even managed to approach the capital of Kabul, of course. This threat of air defense wasn't enough to stop the Afghan insurgents on the ground, but it did have an impact on the types of operations that the Americans could conduct. For example, American fixed-wing aircraft were forced to fly much higher than usual, and they had to avoid flying over certain areas. Altogether, because of the risk of being shot down. Now, obviously, this wasn't the same as full-blown air superiority, since the Americans still operated largely unopposed within the majority of the country. But this change in circumstances did affect the efficiency of their air operations and forced them to alter their tactics. In response, the US developed a new strategy called air dominance, which involved flying more combat sorties at lower altitudes with less ammunition. Although this might seem counterintuitive, this change in strategy proved very effective. Between 2006 and 2011, the number of sorties flown at lower altitudes increased by 37%, and the number of bombs dropped fell by 23%. Yet despite this drop in ordnance used, the casualty rate for insurgents actually increased by 48% during that same time period. The reason for this is simple. By operating at lower altitudes and flying more combat sorties, the American aircraft were able to spend more time directly supporting troops on the ground. And because of this, the US was able to achieve their counterinsurgency goals, despite not having total superiority. In conclusion, air superiority doesn't necessarily mean total superiority, but even partial superiority can completely turn the tide of a conflict. Let us know what you think about this in the comments below. Are there any other examples that you can think of where one side achieved victory despite the other having air superiority? Or are there any of the examples I discussed that you disagree with? Either way, please leave your thoughts in the comments below. And as always, thank you all for watching. Thank you all for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.